as of this time, I have read 3 books that are on the International Book-along list for this year. I probably would have ended up reading more, but I chose to read the biggest bastard on the long list second, and that's the one we're doing the review for today. And the book we're talking about today is called Meta 210. Meta 210 is the story of the Japanese occupation of Korea through the perspective of a full family of about 3 generations of people as they wrestle with that and they struggle with communism and their communist beliefs against the Japanese rule, and also general inequality and difficulties with higher up management. And it's all framed around the story of the youngest person out of the family line who is holding a sit-in at the top of a tower. And he's been in there for like 300 days, and he starts to see ghosts. And that's all you need to know. Let's talk about the worst thing about this book, which is the fucking title. The unpronounceable title. I'm just saying it how I think you're meant to say it, but there's a hyphen in the middle, so is it Meta 2 to 10? 2 to 10? Is it Meta 2210? Like, you can't say the name of it, it's fucked. I like the reason for the title though. The reason it's called that is because at one point one of the characters says that the Meta type of trains are quite common trains that are used for pulling freight, just like all the characters in the book are common folk who are accustomed to manual labor. The flow of this book is really good, particularly in how it cuts back to the main point in its framing device. It's all framed through the head of the main character who's hosting the sit-in, but the book spends a long time in the past. Probably about 80% of the book is in the past, and it uses that to jump around a lot. It's allowed to move sort of omnipotently and flow between locations and set pieces in a very godlike way because it's being viewed through the head of someone who does have that past perspective and is viewing it through the lens of ghosts and memory. So whenever it does that, it never really gets confusing. It moves around a lot, but just when you feel like you need some grounding, it cuts back to the main story, which is the guy at the top of the tower. It cuts back to that and what he's doing, and then he moves back into the past again. So whenever you start to get kind of lost or confused, or kind of the anchor that you had in the world gets kind of loosened a bit, you get pushed back into the framing of the book, and you kind of readjust and then you go again. It's very well structured in that way, and it feels like it's been edited specifically for that purpose. It feels like the author went, alright, we need to have this scene here so that the audience doesn't get confused. We need to do this here. And even though there are a lot of character names, and even though it does have quite an epic scope, it's not confusing really. Even though there are a lot of names, I found it quite easy to keep track of the names because everybody has a very specific role in the plot. And the book doesn't do what Whale does, where Whale's like, yes, oh my god, a character's back, the old woman's back, and the book like announces it to you like, don't you remember her? You do remember the people because they're in very specific situations and they're used and they're talked to by very specific people. So you can kind of categorize people in a certain way because of how much time the book takes place over. So I didn't have a problem with that really, just in the same way that you don't really have a problem with a lot of other epic books with a lot of characters, because you kind of get accustomed to where they're going to show up. My favorite parts of the book are when supernatural things would happen, and it is magical realism in a sense, but it's quite soft magical realism. There's not a lot of weird shit. What happens is, okay, so kind of spoilers, but there are ghosts in the book for real. Like, characters encounter ghosts, and ghosts tell them things. And whenever that happens, it feels like the book builds up to when they're going to appear, so it feels like there's a lot of build-up in historical detail, in setting, in character interaction, and then the ghosts appearing in a scene is kind of like the payoff for that. There's all this sad shit happening, and then the appearance of the ghost to tell someone something is like the final payoff, is the final note on that scene, or note on that event. It's actually very well handled and very well done, and it's usually pretty effective. The book's focus becomes more dry and explanatory as the occupation by Japan becomes more detailed and more oppressive. At the beginning, it's very much like this kind of countryside life that these characters have, and it kind of stops at the point, which is my favorite scene in the book, where there's a big flood and the mother of one of the characters has died, and they come back as a ghost rowing into their house to save their family from a flood. They row in and row them out again. And that's kind of like the final moment before shit really starts to go bad for that family. And that moment is kind of contested. Like, some family members remember it differently. They say there wasn't a ghost, and some family members maintain that it's the ghost of their mother or their grandmother, I believe. And that moment is like a perfect anchor point to finish the setup beforehand of this kind of countryside life. And then as things go bad for them, this woman does show up again and again as kind of like an omen of doom. Like, she'll come into a room and just say very matter-of-factly, oh, this person's died now, and then that character who hears that information will start crying because they know that it's accurate. So she becomes kind of an omen, and there's a few other characters who have similar roles. Some of the magical realism in the book is not super influential to the plot, but it really does fuck with the reader. There's a moment early on when Bakeman, his father, dies, and when he dies, it cuts back to a moment when Bakeman caught a monkfish, and the monkfish gave him this really kind of creepy smile. It like gave him this inhuman smile, and then he cooked it and ate it. And then it cuts back to like the funeral of that character, and that was a very creepy moment that was kind of like, oh, that's really sort of chilling. But that's the kind of magical realism we're doing with. It's the kind of metaphorical small moments that kind of build on and sort of enrich what's happening, or kind of provide final notes to things as they happen. It's not like Whale where random shit just gets thrown at you, and it's not like Whale where magical realism gets used to fill in the gaps. Characters don't need ghosts to help them do things. They sometimes use ghosts to alert them of things, and then they do that thing. But if the ghosts weren't there, the family and the plot would still move in a very similar way. It doesn't feel like a gimmick in this book. It feels like a necessary point to hit at the end. And once the rules of that are established, every time a ghost appears, it becomes quite effective. And the language is not flowery to do with that. Often it's very pared back. A character will come in and you'll be like, oh, this guy's fucking dead, I forgot, you know? It's just the way it's written. It's very interesting. It feels like, again, magical realism is the best term because it feels like just a realistic universe where these things happen. I will mention that one of my sort of criticisms is that a lot of the dialogue is really odd. People will say things like, hey man, and sure, you know, and they'll say shit like that, and it's very weird when every character kind of sounds the same like that. There are certain characters who don't speak with that kind of, hey man, where we going? Oh, I'm just walking out to the store, man. But a lot of the characters who aren't, like, communists speak like that. It's a lot of the common dialogue, and I thought that was weird because it made them all sound very similar. They all sounded like similar people, and I wasn't a huge fan of the choice of that. There's a lot of dry explanatory writing where it sets up things, and it also, like, will dump entire character histories on you before you even get to know the character, and it was that kind of writing that I was really disengaging from, and I was not a big fan of a lot of it, especially because it didn't always feel like we needed that level of detail, or that it mattered that we were getting this really granular detail about how the trains work, what the train line is, who is debating who. There was a lot of stuff that didn't feel like it was necessary for the main plot, but I understand why it's in there, of course. Sometimes the choices are really great. There's a moment where it recounts the main character Gino going to prison in the winter, and the choices of what to focus on in terms of, like, what it was telling you about prison were quite interesting and odd choices, but a lot of the time you'll get, like, as I said, characters' entire birth to death histories, and then that character will do fuck all for the plot and leave, and I found a lot of that quite grating. We often have to see in very specific detail how characters get from one environment to another, and often with the dry explanatory tone, sometimes scenes will happen and the scenes will just kind of fall out of the tone, so you'll get a lot of this dry explanation about all this political zeitgeist, and then a scene will happen with two characters talking in the rain and smoking, and that'll be the kind of typification of what we've just read. And I felt like that was, I kind of got used to that as the tone, but then the book would start to explain in really specific detail how characters were getting from one place to another, and I felt like that could just be cut. I didn't know why we needed to see all of that, like, and then the character got on the bus here, and then they walked 200 paces, and then they turned into this house, and they waited in this house for 10 minutes, and then they bought some food here, and they kept going. Like, we didn't need that. I do like the quality of, like, what amounts to basically a history lesson, and then characters interact and talk and the plot moves on. It felt like characters are kind of stepping out of the history book and interacting and using their agency and then stepping back again. So whenever the book focuses on a character's movement with this really intense detail, it felt a little bit silly and a little bit like it didn't need to be there. And I also thought that was quite fluid, the way that characters would arrive and talk about the December theses or the introduction of communism, and then the book's narrator would move into talking about, and here is how, I don't know, here is how the US then occupied Korea and stuff like that. And it moved between different things fluidly, except for moments where it felt kind of jagged and like, I was getting bored at points, particularly around the middle, where I was like, hurry up, we don't need to see this detail, we've seen it before, we know what the general gist of the detail is going to be, we don't need to see all of it. And then the plot itself I thought was actually quite engaging, especially in the second half. We get introduced to this villain character who's my favorite character probably. I think his name was Yashamita or something, or Yamashita. And he was the villain who's hunting down the two communist characters, and he's friends with one of them and the other one is his brother. Is the friend's brother, I mean. And he is like this really angry man who's constantly on the hunt, and he's like playing this cat and mouse game with the pair of them. And I thought that was quite engaging as well. But then, once the book starts to get engaging in terms of its plot, it will cut back to more of the boring, dry stuff. And I don't necessarily hate the boring, dry stuff, but I was getting confused by how I should be approaching the book, how I should be reading it, if that makes sense. There's like moments in the plot that are really engaging and you read them really fast, like the torture and escape of a character called J.U. that goes for about 30 or 40 pages. That's like page turning, and then the book will just halt. And while it's fluid in the sense of how it moves between its focuses, it's not fluid in the sense of how I was reading it and how I was kind of stopping and going, right, okay, now I've got to ingest all this, and now something fun is happening. And the first half is not like that, but the second half was definitely more like that. It definitely got a bit blockier as it moved on. Not in terms of structure, but in terms of, like, I don't know, I guess focus and the level of my interest. The only specific mistake I really pulled out of the book was there's this thing called the 24-hour rule, where if you get kidnapped by the authorities, you have to resist torture for 24 hours until your kind of comrades can escape. And the book describes like the philosophy behind that twice in 30 pages, and it feels like the author forgot that he had done it already. It was really weird. I don't know why that didn't get edited out, and I don't know if there are more examples like that in the book, in the moments where I got kind of bored. Again, all of the historical background in the book is fine, it's like readable, it's interesting to certain people, I'm sure, but it does do it too many times, and it does interrupt with when I got interested in the plot. So while I would say that the structure of the book is fluid and it does do what it intends to do, it does get kind of hamstrung by the author's insistence on making us understand everything. The main story of the book is the story of Ikkyol and Ilkyol, who are two brothers, and Ilkyol is the main character's grandfather. Yes. And we see the wrap-up of that story in the last quarter or so, when the villain of the book is killed, and then Ilkyol kind of leaves the family, and then Ilkyol's son, who was the main character's father, leaves the family too to go and find him. And then it all kind of draws full circle back to the tower that the main character is sitting on top of. And again, I'm talking about the fluid structure because the way it moves from the past when everything happened up to the modern day was like a really great moment. And the historical detail that it gave during that time period when it's moving forward felt really integrated at that point. The last like 60 pages or so of this book are really fantastic, I thought, and really hammered home everything and helped me overcome some of the blockiness beforehand because I realized the way that the author intended to do that to begin with. Like, the way the author wanted to put in the historical detail with the plot was it's most fully realized in the last 60 pages when you kind of feel everything moving at once, and I really liked that. It was when we got stuck in like a 2-year period with Ikkyol and Ilkyol that the detail felt like it was too much. So that's kind of my general feelings about the book. I would say 15% of it could have been cut out. And then the very ending of the book is like a perfect full circle moment, and the last line of the book I thought was quite sad, and the last moment is quite sad as well, when you realize that Was the fighting worth it? Has anything changed? And it's like this very dour note to kind of leave you on. But it's quite bittersweet when you've seen everything before it and you realize that this character is just another one out of his entire family, out of all these generations of people that have fought. He has now made his mark on his potential successors in that way. So I thought that was a good moment too, but yeah, quite a sad ending. I gave the book a 7 overall. I really liked it. I felt like some of it could have been cut out, but I loved the structure of the book. I loved the way it moved from position to position, even if sometimes it got stuck in certain positions for too long. And I like a lot of the characters. I thought they were quite distinct. And it hits the emotion when it needs to through the help of its kind of magical realist choices. It's at this point that I'll also just log my shortlist predictions, because why not? I might as well. These predictions are completely and utterly random. I have no great perspective on what will be there. I have used no logic, and that of course means that I will do better in my predictions than I did last year. My choices are Mater 210, Undiscovered, Not a River, White Knights, The Details, and Kairos. I'm logging that now. I'm locking in my predictions. We'll see how well I do. Thanks all. I hope this gets on the shortlist because I'd love to hear other people talk about this book too. I enjoyed it overall. It wasn't a masterpiece to me, but there were moments that I found really effective, and I like it overall. It left me feeling quite positive about it. So there you go. Form your own opinions and tell me in the comments if you're gonna bother to read it, and I'll see you next time.